Hi everyone. My name is Dr. Brad Graham. Today we're going to talk about what economics is, specifically focusing on macroeconomics and how it differs from microeconomics. Now, economics in a nutshell is all about choices. How people, firms, and governments make decisions about allocating scarce resources. When we talk about resources, we mean time, money, labor, and all those other things that are limited in supply. So let's start with microeconomics. That's looking at individual players in the economy, how a single business decides how much to produce, or how you decide what to buy when you're at the grocery store. We look at supply and demand on a small scale. We're interested in how price affects how much of something people want to buy or sell, and vice versa. Now, shifting gears to macroeconomics, it's a different ballgame. Instead of focusing on individual consumers or firms, we look at the economy as a whole. We're interested in things like how the total amount of goods and services produced. The GDP changes from year to year. We also look at unemployment rates. How many people who can work are actually working? And inflation rates, which tells us how prices of general goods and services are rising or falling. Now you may ask, why does this matter? It matters. Because these are indicators that tell us how healthy an economy is. High GDP growth. Good. It means people are producing more, likely earning more, and probably living better. High unemployment. Bad. It means a lot of people who could be working aren't, and that could mean they're struggling to make ends meet. High inflation. Usually bad too. It means the money you have buys less and less, so you have to work more just to keep up. Both micro and macroeconomics use models to understand and predict behavior. In micro, you might use a supply and demand curve to predict how a change in price will affect demand for a product. In macro, we might use models to understand how an increase in government spending could lead to higher GDP, but possibly also higher inflation. You see, models simplify complex real-world phenomena. They might leave out a lot of details. But that's okay because we're aiming for a generalized understanding that can guide policymakers and businesses in making informed decisions. So for example, if a macroeconomic model suggests that cutting taxes will boost GDP but also raise inflation, policymakers have to weigh those outcomes and decide what's best for the country at that particular time. Also, macroeconomics helps us understand things like why economies grow over the long term or why they go through periods of boom and bust. Ever heard of economic cycles? That's part of macroeconomics. It also helps us understand why countries trade with each other and what happens when governments run big deficits or surpluses. Now let's talk about the market system, which is the backbone of any capitalist economy. In a market, you have buyers and sellers, and they interact without much government intervention. Prices in a market system are determined by supply and demand. And these prices send signals to producers about what to make more of and what to make less of. In contrast, in a planned economy like you might find in a socialist system, the government makes all those decisions. They decide what gets produced, how much, and what the prices will be. Each system has its pros and cons, and no economy is purely one or the other. Most are a mix. All right. I know that's a lot of information to digest, but it lays the groundwork for everything we're going to cover this semester. Up next, we'll talk about the scope of macroeconomics, where we'll dig deeper into some of these economic indicators and what they tell us. Stay tuned and make sure you're keeping up with the readings. There's no better way to solidify your understanding of these concepts than to see them in action in real-world scenarios. So we've established what macroeconomics is about. Big picture stuff like GDP, unemployment, inflation. But there's more to it, and that's what makes this field so intriguing. Macroeconomics doesn't just tell us what's happening. It also helps us understand why it's happening. Why did the economy go into recession? Why is one country rich while another is poor? These are big questions. And to answer them, we dig into different models and theories. Speaking of theories, they help us build simplified versions of the world to understand complex phenomena. We make assumptions to create these models. Now, you might hear criticism that these models are overly simplistic, but that's by design. The aim is to strip down the real world to its most essential parts to see how they interact. Once we understand that, we can start adding complexity back in. to make the model more realistic and more applicable to actual situations. And you know, these models aren't just academic exercises. They have real-world implications. Think about the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States. When the Fed sets interest rates, it's using macroeconomic models to predict how that will affect things like investment, spending, and ultimately GDP and employment. Lower interest rates make it cheaper to borrow money, which encourages businesses to invest and consumers to spend. But the trade-off might be higher inflation. So you see, it's all connected. Macroeconomics is also deeply tied to policy and governance. Government decisions about taxation and spending are rooted in macroeconomic theories. Ever heard of the term fiscal policy? That's when a government changes its spending levels or tax rates to influence the economy. If the economy is in a slump, for example, the government might decide to spend more money on infrastructure projects, which creates jobs and pushes up GDP. Then there's monetary policy, which is usually the realm of the central bank, not the government. That's about managing the money supply to control inflation and stabilize the economy. Ever heard of quantitative easing? That's a type of monetary policy where the central bank buys financial assets to inject money into the economy. Now, I haven't yet touched on international aspects, but macroeconomics doesn't stop at a country's borders. We live in an interconnected world. If the U.S. economy sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold, so to speak. International trade, exchange rates, balance of payments, they all come under the macroeconomic umbrella. How does a change in interest rates in Europe affect the U.S. dollar? How do trade policies between China and the United States impact global economic growth? These are the kinds of questions macroeconomists grapple with. And here's the kicker. While macroeconomics gives us the tools to understand and analyze these questions, it doesn't always give us clear-cut answers. And that's okay, because the real world is messy. Different models can offer different insights, and it's our job to weigh those insights and arrive at the most informed conclusions we can. So that's what you're signing up for in this course. Tour through big questions and big ideas that shape economies and, by extension, all of our lives. It's a journey, one that I hope will make you not just a better student of economics, but also a more informed citizen. All right. Get ready for the next lecture, where we'll delve into the scope of macroeconomics in more detail. Stay engaged, keep reading, and let's make this a productive semester. So we touched upon a lot, but there's more to explore, particularly ethical considerations that go into economic policy. Now, we might think economics is all about numbers and graphs, but there's a human element to it. When policymakers decide to raise or lower interest rates or to increase government spending, those decisions have real effects on real people. It's not just about boosting GDP or keeping inflation in check. It's also about how these changes affect people's quality of life. Take unemployment, for example. On paper, it's just a number, a statistic. But for someone who's unemployed, it's